Welcome back to the enchanting streets of New Orleans, where magic flows as freely as the Mississippi River, and some love stories are written in starlight and shadow. I'm here to continue the tale of Celeste Martin, the 17-year-old girl, who thought she was inheriting nothing more than her grandmother's Victorian house, only to discover she'd inherited a destiny that would bind her heart to the most dangerous vampire in the French Quarter. If you're just joining us, Celeste has learned that the mysterious Dante Salvador isn't just devastatingly handsome and protective. He's a vampire, and the ancient creatures that attack them in St. Louis Cemetery, they're only the beginning of the supernatural storm about to break over New Orleans. But tonight's story begins with something even more dangerous than ancient vampires. Tonight, Celeste's own power begins to awaken. And in a world where magic always demands a price, some gifts are more perilous than any enemy dot, so settle back. Close your eyes and let me carry you back to the French Quarter, where the morning after changes everything. Celeste Martin woke in her grandmother Marie's four-poster bed to find her breath coming out in visible puffs, despite the fact that it was July in Louisiana. The antique windows of the Victorian mansion were covered in delicate patterns of ice that caught the early morning light and threw it back in prismatic rainbows across the hardwood floors. She sat up slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the energy coursing through her veins. It felt like lightning trapped beneath her skin, like starlight flowing through her bloodstream. Every nerve ending was alive with sensation. Every breath brought with it the taste of magic itself. The mirror across the room showed her reflection, but Celeste barely recognized the girl looking back at her. The same auburn hair fell in waves. Past her shoulders, the same pale skin bore the faint freckles she'd inherited from her grandmother. But her eyes were different. Where once they had been a simple green, now they held flecks of gold that seemed to move and dance in the lamplight. Not static specks of color, but something alive, something that pulsed with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. When she blinked, she could swear she saw sparks of light at the edges of her vision. Celeste swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. The moment her skin made contact with the ancient wood, she gasped. Images flashed through her mind like scenes from a movie played at double speed. She saw women who looked remarkably like her standing in this very room, their hands glowing with the same golden light that now danced behind her eyelids. Generations of us, she thought, though she wasn't sure where the knowledge came from. Generations of guardians, all leading to this moment. The house itself seemed to respond to her awakening. As she stood and walked toward the window, the floorboards beneath her feet began to glow with a soft, warm light. The antique furniture hummed with energy, and she could swear she heard whispers in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. "C'est bienvenue, ma petite fille," came a voice like wind through Spanish moss. "Welcome home, little granddaughter." Celeste spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but the room was empty. Only the lingering scent of jasmine and vanilla suggested that someone or something had been there at all. She approached the vanity where Marie's silver hairbrush and hand mirror still sat, exactly as they had been left. When she picked up the brush, the handle grew warm in her palm, and suddenly the mirror's surface began to shimmer like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. In the reflection, she saw not her own face, but that of another woman. Someone with the same green eyes and auburn hair, but wearing the elaborate dress of the 1800s. The woman's lips moved, forming words that Celeste could hear as clearly as if she were standing in the room. "The blood remembers, child. The power calls to power. But with great gifts come great dangers. Trust your heart, but guard it well. The shadows gather, and they hunger for what flows through your veins." The image faded, leaving Celeste staring at her own reflection once more. But now she could see it. The resemblance wasn't just superficial. She carried the same determined set to her jaw, the same intelligence in her gaze, the same aura of barely contained power that seemed to radiate from her very core. A sound from downstairs made her freeze. Footsteps on the hardwood floor of the entryway, measured and deliberate. Someone was in the house. Celeste's instinct was panic, but then she realized something extraordinary. She could feel the intruder's presence like a warm spot in her. Consciousness. Not threatening, not malevolent, but familiar in a way that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons. Dante. That how she knew it was him. She couldn't say, but she was as certain of his identity as she was of her own name. It was as if some invisible thread connected them, allowing her to sense his location, his mood, even the careful way he was moving through her house to avoid startling her. She grabbed Marie's silk robe from the hook beside the bed and wrapped it around herself, trying to ignore the way the fabric seemed to shimmer and change color as it touched her skin. Everything was responding to her differently now, as if the very world had shifted overnight to accommodate the power awakening within her. The stairs creaked softly under her feet as she made her way down to the main floor. The morning light, filtering through the lace curtains, cast intricate shadows on the walls, and Celeste noticed that the shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, reaching toward her like curious fingers. She found Dante in the kitchen, standing with his back to her as he stared out the window that overlooked Marie's garden. He was dressed in dark jeans and a black shirt that emphasized the powerful lines of his shoulders. His dark hair slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. Even from behind, she could see the tension in his posture, the way he held himself like a predator ready to spring into action. "I felt it happen," he said without turning around, his voice carrying that same deep, rich quality that had haunted her dreams. Every supernatural being in New Orleans felt it. The moment your power awakened, it was like the sun rising in the middle of the night. Celeste moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. How is that possible? "I don't understand any of this." He turned then, and the moment his dark eyes met hers, she saw her own transformation reflected in his gaze. Wonder, concern, and something deeper that made her breath catch in her throat. "Your eyes," he murmured, taking a step toward her. They single quotes re-dot. He seemed to struggle for words. "They're like stars, like captured starlight." The space between them crackled with energy, not just the magical power flowing through her veins, but something else. Something that had been building since the moment they'd met in the cathedral garden. Something that grew stronger every time he looked at her, as if she were the most fascinating creature he'd ever encountered. "Dante," she whispered, and his name on her lips seemed to have physical weight. The air around them shimmered, and she could swear she saw golden threads of light connecting her heart to his. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel. The coolness that seemed to emanate from his skin could catch the scent of cedar and night air that clung to him. "Celeste, what you're becoming, it's dangerous. Beautiful, but dangerous. There are things you need to know, powers you need to learn to control. Teach me," she said immediately, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I want to understand. I want to learn." Something flickered across his features, pride, perhaps, or admiration. "It won't be easy, magic like yours, ... It responds to emotion, to desire, to fear. One moment of lost control could..." He was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze. A low, resonant chime that seemed to come from the very walls of the house itself. It was followed by another, then another, creating a melody that was both beautiful and ominous. "What is that?" Celeste asked, moving instinctively closer to Dante. His expression had gone grim. his body tensing in a way that made her pulse spike with alarm. It's a summoning. The council is calling an emergency meeting. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. They want to see you. Now. The council? Gabriel, Vivian, Sebastian, and the others. They felt your awakening too, and they need to understand what we're dealing with, what you're becoming. He reached out as if to touch her face, then seemed to think better of it, his hand dropping to his side. Celeste, I need you to know what happens next will change everything. Once the council sees the extent of your power, there's no going back to the life you knew. Celeste thought of her quiet existence in Chicago, of her plans to attend college, and study art history, of the normal life she'd always assumed she'd live. All of it seemed like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else. I don't want to go back, she said, and meant it. This, whatever this is, it feels right. Like I've been waiting my whole life to wake up. Dante's smile was soft and proud and tinged with something that looked like regret. Then we'd better get you ready to meet your destiny. The chiming grew louder, more insistent, and Celeste realized that whatever was coming next would test not just her newfound powers, but the growing connection between herself and the enigmatic vampire who had already become so much more than just her protector. As she headed upstairs to dress for whatever lay ahead, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror one more time. The girl looking back at her was a stranger, powerful, mysterious, and crackling with magical energy. But in her eyes, those gold-flecked green eyes that marked her as Marie's granddaughter, she saw something else. She saw a woman ready to fight for the love that was awakening in her heart, no matter what supernatural forces tried to stand in her way. While Dante waited downstairs, giving her privacy to prepare for the council meeting, Celeste found herself drawn not to her wardrobe, but to Marie's study. The room had always felt sacred to her, filled with leather-bound books and antique furniture that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. But now, with her newfound awareness humming through her veins, she could feel something calling to her from within those walls. The study was exactly as Marie had left it. Mahogany bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes, in languages Celeste was only beginning to recognize. French, Spanish, what looked like Latin, and others with symbols that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers that Marie had been working on before her death. But it wasn't the books or the papers that drew Celeste's attention. It was the portrait hanging above the fireplace. The painting showed a woman who could have been Celeste's twin, standing in what looked like the very garden outside this house. But the woman wore the elaborate dress of the 1800s, her auburn hair pinned up in an intricate style that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Her green eyes held the same gold flecks that Celeste now saw in her own reflection, and her hands. Her hands glowed with soft, golden light. A brass nameplate at the bottom of the frame read, Marie Evangeline Martin, Guardian of New Orleans, 1847-1923. 76 years, Celeste whispered to herself. She lived 76 years, but she looks barely 30 in this painting. The portrait seemed to shimmer as she spoke, and for a moment, Celeste could swear the painted woman's lips curved into a smile. Then the sensation passed, leaving her. Wondering if she'd imagined it. She approached the desk, running her fingers over the papers scattered across its surface. Most were written in Marie's careful script, documenting what looked like spells and rituals. But one leather-bound journal caught her attention, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. When she opened it, she gasped. The first page bore an inscription in faded ink. For my granddaughter, who will carry the light when I no longer can. The truth of our bloodline, written in love and warning. Marie. Celeste sank into the leather chair behind the desk and began to read. My dearest Celeste, if you are reading this, then the awakening has begun. You feel the power stirring in your blood. See the world as it truly is rather than as mortals believe it to be. I pray you are not alone in this moment, for the path of a guardian is too heavy for one heart to bear. Our family has served as the magical protectors of New Orleans for over 200 years. We are the bridge between the supernatural and mortal worlds, the keepers of the ancient pacts that keep this city in balance. Each generation, the power passes from grandmother to granddaughter, skipping mothers to maintain the purity of the bloodline. Celeste paused, thinking of her own mother, who had always seemed so determinedly ordinary. Had she known? Had she deliberately chosen a life away from magic? Your mother, my daughter Catherine, was meant to be my successor, but she feared the power, feared what it might cost her. When her abilities began to manifest at 17, she begged me to find another way. There was no other way, of course. The magic chooses its vessel, not the other way around. But Catherine was strong-willed, and she found a way to reject the inheritance. She fell in love with your father, a mortal man with no connection to the supernatural world. Their love was pure, but it came at a cost. To fully bind herself to him, to give herself completely to a mortal life, Catherine had to renounce her magical heritage. The power went dormant, waiting for the next generation. Waiting for you. Celeste felt tears prick her eyes as she read about her mother's sacrifice. She'd always wondered why her parents had been so protective, so determined to keep her away from anything that seemed unusual or unexplained. Now she understood. They'd been trying to give her the normal life that Catherine had chosen for herself. But magic is not so easily denied, my darling girl. The power that should have been your mother's has been building, growing stronger with each passing year. When it awakens in you, it will be more potent than any guardian before you has wielded. This is both a blessing and a curse. The journal's pages seemed to turn themselves as Celeste read, revealing sketches and diagrams that made her pulse quicken. There were drawings of rituals, maps of New Orleans with ley lines marked in glowing ink, and portraits of the supernatural beings who had served as the city's secret protectors throughout the centuries. The vampires you will meet, Gabriel, Vivian, Sebastian, and others, have been our allies for generations. They are bound by ancient oaths to protect the guardians, just as we are bound to maintain the magical barriers that keep darker forces at bay. Trust them, but remember always that they are predators by nature. They will be drawn to your power as surely as flowers turn toward the sun. One vampire's portrait made Celeste's breath catch in her throat. The artist had captured Dante perfectly, the sharp angles of his face, the intensity of his dark eyes, the way he held himself with deadly grace. But this portrait was dated 1891. Dante Salvador has served as my personal protector for over a century. He is dangerous, volatile, haunted by a transformation that nearly destroyed his humanity. But he is also utterly loyal, completely honorable, and the finest warrior I have ever known. If he has chosen to protect you as he once protected me, then your heart is in capable hands. Guard it well. Vampires love with an intensity that can be overwhelming for mortal hearts. Celeste's cheeks flushed as she read Marie's words. Had her grandmother somehow known that Dante would capture her heart so completely? Had she seen this moment coming? The enemies you will face are older than this continent, more powerful than you can imagine. They call themselves the Ancient Ones, and they have hungered for New Orleans' magical confluence for millennia. The barriers I've maintained have kept them at bay, but with my death, those protections are weakening. Only a guardian with your level of power can renew them. But be warned, my darling, the Ancient Ones will not simply attack with force. They are cunning, manipulative creatures who understand that a guardian's greatest strength can also be her greatest weakness. They will use your compassion against you, threaten those you love to force your compliance. They will offer you power beyond imagining in exchange for your allegiance. Do not listen. Do not waver. The moment you begin to doubt, they will have won. The next page contained a detailed map of New Orleans, but unlike any map Celeste had ever seen, this one showed the city as it existed in the supernatural realm, ley lines crisscrossing like a vast spider web, convergence points marked with glowing symbols, and areas of shadow that seemed to move and shift even as she watched. The heart of our power lies beneath St. Louis Cathedral. There, in chambers older than the church itself, stands the Nexus, a crystalline formation that channels the Earth's natural magic into the protective barriers around our city. As guardian, you must learn to commune with the Nexus to feed it your power and draw from its ancient wisdom. But accessing the Nexus requires more than magical ability. It demands absolute purity of purpose, complete clarity of heart. The crystal can sense deception, fear, selfish desire. It will only accept a guardian who approaches with love, love for the city, love for its people, and yes, love for herself. Do not be afraid of the emotions awakening in your heart, Celeste. Love is not a weakness to be conquered, but a strength to be embraced. Celeste touched her lips, thinking of the moment earlier when Dante had looked at her with such intensity, when the space between them had crackled with more than just magical energy. Was that what Marie meant? Was the connection she felt to Dante part of her destiny as guardian? The final entry in the journal was dated just a week before Marie's death. I feel my time growing short, and there's so much I still need to tell. The prophecies speak of a guardian whose power will exceed all who came before, one who will either save our world or watch it burn. I believe that guardian is you, my precious granddaughter. But prophecies are tricky things. They show what might be, not what must be. Your choices will determine which future comes to pass. Remember always that you are loved. By me, by the ancestors whose blood flows in your veins, by the allies who will stand with you in the darkness to come. And perhaps, if the fates are kind, by a vampire whose heart beats only for you. Trust in your power, trust in your allies, but most of all, trust in love. It is the only force stronger than death, the only magic that can transcend time itself. All my love and hopes for your future. Grandmère Marie. Celeste closed the journal with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the weight of everything she'd learned. She wasn't just inheriting magical powers, she was inheriting a legacy that stretched back centuries, a responsibility that could determine the fate of everyone she'd ever loved. But she wasn't alone. The vampires downstairs, especially Dante, were bound by oaths older than she could imagine to help her succeed. And somewhere in the supernatural realm, the spirits of generations of guardian women were watching over her, ready to lend their strength when she needed it most. A soft knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. Celeste, Dante's voice was gentle, concerned. The council grows impatient. Are you ready? She stood, smoothing down the midnight blue dress she'd chosen, one that had belonged to Marie and fit her as if it had been tailored specifically for her body. As she moved toward the door, she caught sight of herself in the mirror above the fireplace. The girl looking back at her was no longer the uncertain teenager who'd arrived in New Orleans just days ago. This was a guardian, a protector, a woman ready to embrace her destiny. I'm ready, she called back and meant it, but as she opened the study door and saw Dante waiting for her in the hallway, devastating in his dark clothing and looking at her with an expression that made her pulse race, she realized that preparing for her magical destiny was only half the battle. The other half would be learning to navigate the growing love in her heart without losing herself in its intensity. The walk through the French Quarter to St. Louis Cathedral was unlike anything Celeste had ever experienced. With her newly awakened senses, she could perceive the city as it truly existed, a layered tapestry of the mundane and the magical, where tourists snapped photos of wrought iron balconies while supernatural beings conducted ancient business in the shadows. Mere feet away, Dante moved beside her with the fluid grace of a predator, his dark eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Every few steps, he would place a protective hand on the small of her back, guiding her around corners or warning her of uneven cobblestones. Each touch sent electricity racing up her spine, making it difficult to concentrate on anything beyond the way her body responded to his presence. "Tell me about them," Celeste said as they walked past a street musician whose saxophone seemed to be playing notes that existed in colors rather than sound. "The council members. What should I expect?" Dante's expression grew thoughtful. "Gabriel. Russo is the eldest among us, though he appears no older than 35. He was turned during the Renaissance and has ruled the New Orleans vampires for over 4 centuries. He's diplomatic, intelligent, but utterly ruthless when protecting what he considers his. He genuinely cared for Marie, which is why he'll likely support you, but he's also practical above all else." They paused at a crosswalk, though no traffic was coming. The street lamps flickered in a pattern that Celeste was beginning to recognize as some form of supernatural communication. "Vivienne LeBlanc is complex," Dante continued, his voice carrying a note of caution. "She's French nobility, turned in 1789 during the Revolution. Beautiful beyond description, but don't let that fool you. She survived centuries by being more cunning than anyone else in the room. She and Marie had a complicated relationship. Mutual respect, but underlying tension." "Why?" Celeste asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Because Vivienne has never understood why guardians choose to protect mortals when we could rule them instead. She believes in supernatural supremacy, and she's never made peace with the idea that vampires should serve witches, even ones as powerful as your grandmother." They turned onto Royal Street, and Celeste could see the cathedral's distinctive spires rising ahead of them. But something was different about the building now. Where before she'd seen only an impressive but ordinary church, now she could perceive the layers of magical protection woven into its very stones. Wards glowed softly along the walls, and she could sense vast spaces beneath the structure that existed in dimensions tourists would never imagine. "And Sebastian?" she prompted. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sebastian Thorne is the wild card. Turned in 1692 during the Salem witch trials, which left him with complicated feelings about magic users. He's loyal to Gabriel and respects the alliance with the Guardians, but he's also the most likely to challenge your authority if he perceives weakness. They reached the cathedral's main entrance, but instead of climbing the front steps, Dante led her around to a side door that seemed to shimmer with the same otherworldly energy that surrounded the entire building. He placed his palm against the aged wood, and Celeste heard the soft click of locks disengaging, though she could see no visible mechanism. "Remember," Dante said, turning to face her before they entered, "you are not a supplicant seeking their approval. You are the guardian, heir to a power older than any of them possess. Marie's blood flows in your veins, and with it, the authority to command their allegiance. Don't let them forget that." The corridor beyond the door was narrow and lined with stones that looked far older than the cathedral above. Ancient symbols were carved into the walls, glowing faintly with phosphorescent light that pulsed in rhythm with Celeste's heartbeat. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying with it the scent of incense and something else, something that spoke of power and age and secrets kept for centuries. They emerged into a vast circular chamber that took Celeste's breath away. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by columns carved from what appeared to be single pieces of marble. Candles burned in iron sconces along the walls, their flames dancing without any apparent breeze. And in the center of the room stood a table carved from obsidian, its surface so perfectly black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 3 figures were already seated at the table, and they looked up as Celeste and Dante entered. Gabriel. Russo was exactly as Dante had described, tall, elegant, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his brown eyes held the depth that came from centuries of experience. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that managed to be both modern and timeless, and when he smiled at Celeste, she could see the intelligence that had allowed him to rule for so long. "Celeste Martin," he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Welcome to the heart of our sanctuary. Your grandmother graced these chambers for over 60 years. It is an honor to welcome her successor." Vivienne LeBlanc was stunning in a way that was almost painful to look at directly. Her platinum blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, and her ice blue eyes seemed to see straight through. To Celeste's soul, she wore a dress that appeared to be made of liquid silver, and when she moved, it caught the candlelight in ways that seemed to defy physics. "So young," Vivienne murmured, her French accent lending music to words that somehow felt like criticism. Marie was 17 when her powers awakened, but she had been raised in our world. This one, her gaze swept over Celeste with calculating assessment. This one still smells of mortality. Sebastian Thorne was the most unsettling of the 3. Where Gabriel projected authority and Vivienne radiated ethereal beauty, Sebastian seemed to carry darkness itself. His black hair was longer than the others, framing a face that was all sharp angles and predatory grace. His green eyes, so pale they were nearly colorless, fixed on Celeste with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "The Guardian bloodline awakens at last," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Celeste couldn't place. "Tell me, little witch, do you understand what you've inherited? Do you comprehend the weight of the responsibility now resting on your shoulders?" Before Celeste could respond, Dante stepped closer to her, his presence both protective and supportive. "She understands more than you might expect, Sebastian, and she's already demonstrated power beyond what any of us anticipated." "Has she?" Sebastian leaned back in his chair, a predatory smile playing at his lips. "Forgive me if I require a demonstration. The barriers protecting our city grow weaker with each passing day. If this girl is to be our salvation, I would see proof of her capabilities." Gabriel raised a hand, his expression diplomatic but firm. "Sebastian, there will be time for assessments. First, Celeste must understand the scope of what we face." He gestured for her to take the empty chair across from him, and as she sat, Celeste felt the obsidian table respond to her presence. The surface began to glow with soft golden light, and suddenly she could see images forming in its depths. Not reflections, but visions of the past and present. "For over 200 years, Gabriel began, the Guardian bloodline has maintained the magical barriers that protect New Orleans from supernatural threats too dangerous for the mortal world. To comprehend, your great-grandmother, Evangeline, was the first to bind our kind to the service of the Guardians. She understood that vampires, for all our power, lack the connection to natural magic necessary to maintain the city's defenses." Images in the table showed scenes of old New Orleans, gaslit streets, horse-drawn carriages, and figures in period dress performing elaborate rituals beneath the light of the full moon. Celeste saw women who looked remarkably like her standing in this very chamber, their hands glowing with the same golden energy that now hummed beneath her skin. Each guardian has added to the protections, Vivian continued, her tone carrying grudging respect. Layer upon layer of magical barriers, early warning systems, and defensive spells. Your grandmother Marie was perhaps the most gifted of her line. Under her protection, New Orleans became a sanctuary for supernatural beings seeking refuge from persecution elsewhere. But those protections are failing, Sebastian added bluntly. Marie's death created a power vacuum that our enemies have been quick to exploit. The Ancient Ones have already begun testing our defenses, sending scouts and lesser minions to probe for weaknesses. The images in the table shifted, showing darker scenes, creatures of shadow and malice moving through the night, their presence leaving trails of decay and corruption wherever they passed. Celeste saw glimpses of the beings she'd encountered in the cemetery, but also others. Things that seemed to be made of living darkness, entities that appeared to exist partially outside normal reality. Who are they? Celeste asked, though part of her was afraid to know the answer. Beings older than civilization itself, Gabriel replied. They existed before humans learned to use fire, before the first vampire was turned, before magic took the forms we recognize today. Their hunger and hatred given consciousness, and they see our world as nothing more than a feeding ground. They've been trying to claim New Orleans for millennia, Dante added from his position behind Celeste's chair. The convergence of ley lines beneath the city makes it a nexus of power that would allow them to tear holes between dimensions, bringing their entire realm into ours. Celeste felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber's temperature. And you think I can stop them? We don't think, child, Vivian said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. We know the power awakening in you is unlike anything we've witnessed. When your abilities manifested this morning, every supernatural being in the city felt it, but so did our enemies. Sebastian stood abruptly, moving to one of the windows that somehow looked out onto the cemetery despite the fact that they were underground. Even now, they gather their forces. The scouts we've captured speak of a great convergence, an assault that will begin with the next new moon. That's in 5 days, Gabriel said quietly. The weight of revelation settled over Celeste like a heavy cloak. 5 days to master powers she'd only just discovered. 5 days to prepare for a battle against enemies she barely understood. 5 days to become the guardian that New Orleans needed. But as she looked around the table at the 3 vampires who had served her family for generations and felt Dante's presence like a warm flame at her back, she realized she wasn't facing this alone. She had allies, protectors, and if the growing warmth in her chest was any indication, perhaps something even more precious than that, what do I need to do? She asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Gabriel smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber, Celeste saw genuine warmth in his expression. First, you need to connect with the Nexus, the crystal heart that channels the city's magical defenses. Marie was the only one who could access it directly, but with her gone, the barriers are running on stored power, Vivian finished. Power that will be exhausted within the week unless a new guardian can renew them. Sebastian turned back from the window, his pale eyes gleaming with something that might have been approval. The Nexus lies deeper still, in chambers that predate this cathedral by centuries. But accessing it requires more than magical ability. It's a man's absolute purity of purpose and complete clarity of heart. Celeste thought of Marie's journal, of the warning about love being strength rather than weakness. As if sensing her thoughts, Dante's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder, and she felt some of the tension leave her body. Then that's where we start, she said, rising from her chair with newfound determination. Show me to the Nexus. The passage leading deeper beneath the cathedral was older than anything Celeste had ever seen. The walls were carved from living rock, smooth and black as obsidian, with veins of what looked like silver running through them in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Each step downward took them further from the world she knew and deeper into a realm where magic was as fundamental as breathing. Gabriel led the way, his movements silent despite the stone steps beneath. Their feet. Behind him, Vivian glided with ethereal grace, her silver dress seeming to generate its own luminescence in the tunnel's darkness. Sebastian brought up the rear, his pale eyes reflecting what little light filtered down from above like those of a nocturnal predator. But it was Dante's presence beside her that kept Celeste grounded as they descended into the earth's depths. Every few steps, his fingers would brush against hers, seemingly accidental touches that she knew were deliberately meant to reassure her. The connection between them had grown stronger since her awakening that morning, and now she could feel his emotions as clearly as her own. Protectiveness, pride, and an underlying current of something deeper that made her pulse quicken. The Nexus has stood here since before humans built their first settlements along the Mississippi. Gabriel's voice echoed softly in the narrow passage. Some say it was placed by the earth spirits themselves. Others believe it's a remnant of the civilization that existed here before recorded history. What we know for certain is that it chooses its guardians as much as they choose it. The temperature dropped noticeably as they continued their descent, and Celeste's breath began to mist in the increasingly frigid air. But more than cold, she could feel power, ancient, immense, and utterly alien. It pressed against her consciousness like a vast intelligence taking her measure, and she had the unsettling sensation of being examined by something that existed on a scale she couldn't comprehend. "What happens if it rejects me?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "It won't," Dante said with quiet certainty. "Your blood calls to it as surely as the tide calls to the moon. I can feel it responding to your presence." Vivian glanced back at them, her ice blue eyes unreadable in the dim light. The Nexus has never rejected a true guardian, but it has been known to test them, sometimes quite severely. "What kind of tests?" Celeste pressed. Sebastian's laugh was low and dark. "The kind that reveal whether you're worthy of the power you seek to claim. The crystal doesn't simply give its gifts freely, little witch. It demands to see the truth of who you are, your deepest fears, your greatest desires, your capacity for both love and sacrifice." The passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber that stole Celeste's breath away. The ceiling soared overhead, lost in shadows that seemed to move and shift with their own mysterious purpose. But it was the center of the room that commanded attention. Rising from the floor like a tree made of pure starlight stood the Nexus. The crystal formation was easily 20 feet tall, its surface faceted in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Light seemed to originate from within its core, not the warm golden glow of magic Celeste was growing accustomed to, but something cooler and more ancient. Colors that had no names danced through the crystal's depths, and she could hear something that was almost like music emanating from its core. The air around the Nexus shimmered with concentrated power, and Celeste realized that the veins of silver in the chamber walls all led to this spot, channeling energy from every corner of New Orleans into this single, magnificent focal point. "Beautiful," she whispered, taking an unconscious step toward the crystal. "And dangerous," Gabriel warned, though his tone was gentle. "The Nexus contains the concentrated magical energy of every guardian who has ever touched it. Marie's power flows through it, as does that of her grandmother and her grandmother before her. To connect with it means to open yourself to all of their memories, their knowledge, their pain, but also their strength," Vivian added, moving to stand at the edge of the circle of silver symbols carved into the floor around the crystal. "Everything. They learned every spell they mastered, every battle they fought, all of it becomes part of you. Celeste felt Dante's hand slip into hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. The contact sent warmth shooting up her arm, and suddenly the overwhelming presence of the Nexus felt less intimidating and more like a challenge she was meant to face. I have to do this alone, don't I? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The initial contact, yes, Gabriel confirmed. But remember, you carry the blood of every guardian who came before you. You are never truly alone. She squeezed Dante's hand once, drawing strength from his steady presence, then released him and stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed the boundary of the silver circle, the Nexus pulsed with brilliant light, and the chamber filled with a sound like crystal bells singing in harmony. The carved symbols beneath her feet began to glow, creating a pathway of light that led directly to the towering crystal. Each step brought waves of sensation, flashes of memory that weren't her own, emotions that belonged to women long dead, whispers in languages that predated modern speech, but that she understood with perfect clarity. Welcome, daughter of our. Lined up, the power awakens at last. So young, so untested, but the blood runs true. She will need great strength for what is to come. Love will be her greatest weapon and her deepest vulnerability. As she drew closer to the Nexus, the voices of her ancestors grew stronger, more distinct. She saw flashes of their lives, Marie as a young woman, defiant and powerful, standing against creatures of shadow in the very chamber where Celeste now walked. Her great-grandmother, Evangeline, negotiating the first treaties with the vampire. Clans that would bind their fates together. Generation after generation of strong women who had sacrificed everything to protect the city they loved. When she reached the crystal itself, Celeste paused. This close, she could feel the Nexus's awareness, like a living thing examining her soul. It was ancient beyond measure, patient in the way of mountains and oceans, but also intensely curious about this newest guardian who sought to claim its power. Place your hands upon the crystal. Child, came Marie's voice, clearer than the others. Let it see who you truly are. Celeste reached out with trembling fingers and placed her palms against the Nexus's faceted surface. The moment her skin made contact with the crystal, reality exploded into fragments of light and sensation. She was no longer standing in the chamber beneath the cathedral. She was everywhere and nowhere, experiencing the memories of every guardian who had ever touched the Nexus while simultaneously being examined by the crystal's vast intelligence. She saw New Orleans as it had been centuries ago, a wild frontier settlement where humans and supernatural beings existed in uneasy proximity. She watched the first guardian, a woman named Celeste, after whom she had been named, discover the Nexus in its original form, a natural crystal formation in a cave by the river. She experienced the binding rituals that had tied the vampire. Clans to her family's service felt the weight of responsibility as generation after generation of guardians expanded and strengthened the city's magical defenses, but the Nexus showed her darker memories too. Guardians who had been broken by the responsibility, who had lost themselves in the power they wielded. She felt the temptation that came with such abilities, the desire to control rather than protect, to rule rather than serve. She experienced the loneliness that was the constant companion of those who stood between the mortal and supernatural worlds, belonging fully to neither. Show me your heart, the Nexus demanded, its voice like the sound of continents shifting. Show me what you would sacrifice for duty. Show me what you would sacrifice for love. Suddenly, Celeste found herself in a vision so real she could feel New Orleans burning around her. The Ancient Ones had broken through the barriers, and creatures of shadow and malice swarmed through the French Quarter. Buildings crumbled, humans fled in terror, and the vampire council lay broken and defeated in the ruins of their sanctuary dot in this nightmare vision. She stood before the Nexus with two choices. She could use all of her power to repair the barriers, sealing away the ancient ones forever, but doing so would drain her life force completely, leaving her as dead as the enemies she defeated. Or she could accept an offer from the creatures of darkness, joining with them and using her guardian abilities to help them reshape reality itself. They would give her immortality, power beyond imagining, and the chance to rule over the world they created. All they asked in return was that she allow them to feed on human suffering for eternity. But there was a third element to the vision that made her choice infinitely more complex. Dante stood chained in shadows, his dark eyes filled with pain and desperate love. The Ancient Ones had captured him, and they whispered that they would torture him for centuries if she chose to sacrifice herself. Only by accepting their offer could she save him. Only by betraying everything she was meant to protect could she protect the one person who had come to mean everything to her. Choose, the Nexus commanded. Show me the truth of your heart. In the vision, Celeste looked at Dante, at his beautiful face twisted with anguish, at the love shining in his eyes despite the pain. She felt the bond between them like a physical thing, the connection that had grown stronger every moment since they'd met. He was her other half, the piece of her soul she hadn't known was missing. Then she looked at the city burning around them, at the humans fleeing in terror, at the supernatural beings who had trusted her to protect them. She thought of Marie's words about love being strength rather than weakness, about the responsibility that came with power. I choose love, she said clearly, her voice carrying over the sound of destruction, but not the selfish kind. I choose love for all who need protection, love for this city that has been entrusted to my care, love for the future that can only exist if I do what's right rather than what's easy. She turned to Dante, tears streaming down her face. I love you, she whispered. I love you enough to save you by saving everyone else. And with that declaration, she poured all of her power into the Nexus, feeling her life force drain away even as the barriers around New Orleans blazed back to life, stronger than they had ever been. But instead of death, she felt the crystal's approval wash over her like warm sunlight. The vision faded, and she found herself back in the real chamber, her hands still pressed against the Nexus's surface. But now the crystal was singing, a sound of pure joy that filled the space with radiant light. Well chosen, guardian. You understand that love, which demands sacrifice, is the truest love of all. The power is yours, freely given, completely granted. Use it while light poured from the Nexus into Celeste's body, and she felt her magical abilities expand exponentially. She could sense every ley line beneath New Orleans, could feel the barriers that protected the city humming with renewed strength. Knowledge flowed into her mind, spells her ancestors had mastered, secrets of power that had been guarded for centuries, understanding of forces that most humans couldn't even imagine. When the transfer was complete, she stumbled backward, overwhelmed by the transformation she'd undergone. Strong arms caught her before she could fall, and she looked up to find Dante's face inches from her own, his dark eyes blazing with concern and something deeper. You did it, he breathed, and she could hear the wonder in his voice. The barriers are stronger than they've been in decades. I can feel them singing. Around them, Gabriel, Vivian, and Sebastian watched with expressions of awe and relief. The chamber itself seemed brighter, more alive, as if the successful bonding between Guardian and Nexus had awakened energies that had been dormant for too long. But as Celeste looked into Dante's eyes, she realized that the most important transformation hadn't been magical at all. She loved this vampire with a certainty that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. And if the way he was looking at her was any indication, her feelings were entirely reciprocated. What happens now? She whispered. His smile was soft and full of promise. Now we prepare for war, and we do it together. By the time they returned to Marie's house, the sun was setting over the French Quarter, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed to echo the magical energy still humming through Celeste's veins. The successful bonding with the Nexus had left her feeling simultaneously exhausted and electrified, as if she'd been struck by lightning and somehow survived to tell the tale. Dante walked beside her in comfortable silence, but she could feel his awareness of her every movement, every breath. The connection between them had grown stronger since her transformation, and now she could sense his emotions as clearly as her own, the pride he felt in her accomplishment, the protectiveness that seemed to be his constant state around her, and underneath it all, a growing warmth that made her pulse quicken every time their eyes met. "The power you absorbed from the Nexus," he said as they climbed the front steps to the Victorian mansion, "it will take time to fully integrate. You'll likely experience some fluctuations as your body adjusts to containing so much magical energy." Even as he spoke, Celeste could feel what he meant. The golden light that had settled into her bones during the bonding ceremony seemed to ebb and flow like a tide, sometimes leaving her feeling perfectly normal, other times making her fingertips tingle with barely contained power. When she'd reached for the door handle, it had started to glow at her touch, and she'd had to concentrate to keep from accidentally melting the brass. "Is it dangerous?" she asked, stepping into the familiar warmth of Marie's entryway. "Not dangerous, exactly," Dante replied, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely certain, but unpredictable. "Which is why you need to learn control as quickly as possible. The Ancient Ones will sense what happened today. They'll know. The barriers have been renewed and strengthened. They'll also know that means a new guardian has claimed the Nexus." The implications of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. "So they'll come for me. They'll try." His voice carried a note of steel that made something flutter in her chest. "But they'll have to go through me first, through all of us." The fierce protectiveness in his tone made her turn to face him fully. In the soft lamplight of the hallway, he looked like something from one of her childhood fairy tales, dangerously beautiful, utterly devoted, and somehow both mortal and otherworldly at the same time. The formal clothing he'd worn to meet the council had been replaced by dark jeans and a black shirt that clung to the powerful lines of his shoulders, making him seem more approachable but no less magnificent. "Dante," she began, then found herself at a loss for words. "How did you thank someone for being willing to die for you? How did you express the way your heart started racing every time he looked at you with those dark, intense eyes?" He seemed to understand her struggle because he stepped closer, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face with infinite gentleness. "You don't need to say anything, Celeste." "I know." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibilities and unspoken promises. Celeste found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes drifting closed as she savored the warmth of his fingers. Against her skin, she could feel the careful control he was maintaining, the way he held himself back despite the connection that seemed to be pulling them together like a magnetic force. But then the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the hour, breaking the spell, and Dante stepped back with visible effort. "We should begin your training," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "The garden will provide enough space, and the natural energy there will help you focus." Marie's garden was even more magical at twilight than it had been during the day. The ancient oak trees created a natural cathedral overhead, their branches intertwined in patterns that seemed deliberately designed to channel and concentrate supernatural energy. Night-blooming jasmine released its intoxicating fragrance into the humid air, while Spanish moss swayed in breezes that carried whispers and languages older than recorded history. Dante led her to the center of the garden, where a circular fountain, surrounded by 7 stone benches, created a perfect training space. The water in the fountain glowed with soft phosphorescence, and Celeste realized that this was another focus point for the magical energy that flowed beneath New Orleans. Power you absorbed from the Nexus is vast, Dante began, positioning himself across from her beside the fountain. But raw power without control is more dangerous than having no magic at all. The first lesson every guardian must learn is how to channel energy with precision rather than simply unleashing it. He moved with fluid grace to one of the stone benches, retrieving what looked like a wooden box filled with various objects, crystals, metal rods, pieces of different stones, and items she didn't recognize. "These are focusing tools," he explained, setting the box on the fountain's edge. "Each one responds to different types of magical energy. We'll start with the simplest exercises and work our way up to more complex manipulations." He selected a small crystal sphere from the collection, holding it up so that it caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the oak leaves. "This responds to healing energy, one of the most basic and safest forms of magic to practice. I want you to focus on the crystal and try to make it glow." Celeste took the sphere in her palm, surprised by how warm it felt against her skin. She closed her eyes and tried to reach for the power she'd felt flowing through her veins since the Nexus bonding. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she felt it, a warm current of energy moving from her core down through her arm and into her hand. The crystal began to pulse with soft golden light. "Beautiful," Dante murmured, and the approval in his voice made her heart skip a beat. "But now try to control the intensity. Make it brighter, then dimmer, then brighter again." She focused harder, imagining the light as something she could adjust like a dimmer switch. The crystal responded, flaring brilliant and then fading to a barely perceptible glow before brightening to a steady, warm radiance. "Perfect control," Dante said, moving closer to examine her work. "Most new guardians take weeks to achieve that level of precision. You're remarkable, Celeste." The sincerity in his voice, combined with his proximity, made concentration increasingly difficult. She could smell the cedar and night air scent that seemed to cling to him, could feel the coolness that radiated from his supernatural physiology. When he reached out to steady her hand as she practiced with the crystal, his fingers lingered against hers far longer than necessary. "What's next?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way his touch was affecting her pulse. Selected a metal rod from the collection, this one inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. "This focuses defensive energy, the type of magic you'll need to protect yourself and others. But it's more volatile than healing magic, so we need to be careful." As he handed her the rod, their fingers brushed again, and this time the contact sent a visible spark of energy crackling between them. The rod began to glow, even before she'd attempted to channel power into it, responding to the magical connection that seemed to exist between them. "Interesting," Dante murmured, his dark eyes fixed on the point where their hands had touched. "I've never seen a focusing tool respond to proximity like that. Is that bad?" Celeste asked, though the warm feeling spreading through her chest suggested otherwise. "Not bad," he replied, his voice dropping to that intimate whisper that made her shiver, "but unexpected. The bond between us seems to be affecting your magic in ways I didn't anticipate." He moved to stand behind her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders as he guided her into the proper stance for defensive casting. "Feel the energy building in your core," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear, "but don't force it. Let it flow naturally through the rod." It was impossible to concentrate with him so close, with his hands on her body and his voice sending shivers down her spine. The defensive energy he'd mentioned was indeed more volatile than the healing. Magic. She could feel it crackling through the rod like contained lightning, eager to be released. I can't focus, she admitted, turning slightly so she could see. His face, you're too distracting. Something flashed in his dark eyes, heat, desire, and a carefully controlled hunger that made her breath catch. Celeste, he said, her name carrying a warning, but instead of stepping away, she turned fully to face him, the magical rod still glowing between them. I felt it during the vision with the Nexus, she said, her voice steady despite the racing. Of her heart, what I would choose, what I would sacrifice. I know what I want, Dante. His hands slid from her shoulders to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. You're 17 years old. You've just inherited power beyond imagination. You don't know what you want. I know I want you, she replied without hesitation. I've known since the moment I saw you in the cathedral garden. I've known since you carried me home from the cemetery. I've known since you looked at me like I was something precious rather than something broken. The careful control he'd been maintaining seemed to crack at her words. She saw the moment he stopped fighting the connection between them, saw the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. You don't understand what you're asking for, he said, but his hands remained. Gentle on her face, his thumbs continuing their soft caresses. Vampires love with an intensity that can be overwhelming. When we choose someone, when we truly claim them as ours, it's not a casual thing. It's absolute, eternal, consuming. Good, Celeste whispered, rising up on her toes so that her face was inches from his. I don't want casual. I don't want temporary. I want you, all of you, for as long as you'll have me. The magical rod in her hand blazed with golden light as her emotions peaked, but she barely noticed. All of her attention was focused on the vampire standing before her, on the war between desire and restraint playing out in his dark eyes. Celeste. He breathed, and she could hear centuries of longing in the way he spoke her name. Kiss me, she said simply. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Then his resolve shattered completely, and his lips crashed down onto hers with a passion that stole her breath away. The kiss was everything she'd dreamed it would be, and more. Desperate. Tender, fierce, and gentle all at once. His mouth moved against hers with the skill that came from decades of experience, but also with an emotion so raw it made her knees weak. She could taste the night air on his lips, could feel the careful control he was still maintaining even as he claimed her mouth with increasing intensity. The magical energy flowing between them exploded outward, and suddenly every flower in the garden burst into bloom simultaneously. The fountain's water began to glow like liquid starlight, and the very air around them shimmered with golden power. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Celeste realized that something fundamental had changed between them. The connection she'd felt growing stronger throughout the day had solidified into something unbreakable, a bond that seemed to exist on both the emotional and magical planes. Mine, Dante whispered against her lips, the single word carrying more weight than any elaborate declaration of love. Yours, she agreed without hesitation, meaning it with every fiber of her being. But even as they stood wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the magical chaos their kiss had unleashed, Celeste could feel darker forces stirring in the shadows beyond the garden. The Ancient Ones had indeed sensed her successful bonding with the Nexus, and they were already beginning to move. The battle for New Orleans and for their love was about to begin. The first sign that something was wrong came at 3 in the morning, when every bird in New Orleans stopped singing at once. Celeste woke to absolute silence, not the comfortable quiet of night, but the oppressive hush that falls over the world when predators are hunting. She sat up in Marie's 4-poster bed, her newly awakened senses immediately detecting the wrongness that had settled over the city like a suffocating blanket. The temperature in the room had dropped at least 20 degrees, and frost was once again forming on the windows despite the Louisiana heat. But this wasn't the gentle manifestation of her awakening powers. This was something alien and malevolent, a cold that spoke of spaces between stars where no life could survive. Dante appeared in her doorway before she could call his name, moving with the fluid urgency of a predator responding to threat. He was already dressed in dark clothing that would allow him to blend with shadows, and his normally controlled expression was tight with concern. "You feel it too," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "What is it?" Celeste asked, slipping from the bed and reaching for the dark blue dress she'd worn to meet the council. The fabric seemed to respond to her touch now, reinforcing itself with protective magic that she somehow knew how to weave without conscious thought. "They're here," Dante replied grimly. "Not in the city yet, but close. The Ancient Ones are gathering their forces just beyond the barrier's edge, testing for weaknesses." As if his words had summoned it, a sound echoed across New Orleans that made Celeste's blood freeze in her veins. It was like whale song crossed with the shriek of metal tearing, a call that seemed to resonate in the bone-deep places where humanity's oldest fears lived. Other voices answered it, dozens of them, creating a discordant chorus that spoke of hunger and hatred older than civilization. "How many?" Celeste asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the terror clawing at her insides. Dante moved to the window, his supernatural sight piercing the darkness beyond the garden. "More than we anticipated. Morgan wasn't just sending scouts, he's been building an army." His expression darkened further as he continued to survey the night. "I count at least 50 individual entities, and that's just what I can see directly. There could be twice that number hiding in spaces between dimensions." The implications hit Celeste like a physical blow. Even with her newly enhanced powers, even with the council's support, how could they possibly face such overwhelming odds? New sound cut through the night, the desperate tolling of church bells across the French Quarter. Not the regular chimes that marked the hours, but the frantic, irregular pealing that had once warned of fire or invasion. The supernatural community was sounding the alarm, calling all defenders to prepare for battle. "We need to reach the council." "Chambers," Dante said, turning from the window. "Gabriel will want to coordinate our response, and we'll be stronger if we're together." But even as he spoke, the house around them began to react to the approaching threat. The walls themselves started to hum with protective energy, and Celeste could see golden light beginning to flow through the antique woodwork like luminous veins. Marie's words were activating automatically, recognizing the danger and preparing the mansion's defenses. "The house knows," Celeste breathed, placing her palm against the nearest wall and feeling the magical currents flowing beneath her touch. "Your grandmother built layers of protection into every beam and stone," Dante explained, moving to her side. "But they're designed to hold off normal supernatural threats, not something like what's coming for us now." As if to underscore his words, a tremor ran through the Victorian mansion, not an earthquake, but something far more ominous. The Ancient Ones were testing the barriers directly, searching for the precise frequency that would allow them to shatter the magical protections around New Orleans. "Celeste." Dante's voice carried an urgency that made her turn immediately. "I need you to listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you may be the most important thing you ever hear." The seriousness in his tone made her pulse spike with alarm. "What is it?" "The creatures gathering beyond our barriers aren't just mindless destroyers. They're ancient, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. They've been planning this assault for decades, waiting for Marie's death to create the opening they needed." He moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face in a gesture that was both tender and desperate. They know about you, Celeste. They know about the bonding with the Nexus, and they know about us. About us? The connection we formed, the bond that was sealed when we kissed in the garden. It's made you more powerful, but it's also made you more vulnerable. Ancient ones feed on strong emotions, and love is the strongest emotion of all. His dark eyes were haunted with a pain she didn't understand. They'll try to use me against you. They'll threaten me, hurt me, make you watch me suffer. And if that doesn't work, he trailed off, but Celeste could see the rest of the thought in his expression. If emotional manipulation failed, the ancient ones would simply kill him to break. Her heart, knowing that grief would make her either more malleable or completely reckless. Then we don't give them the chance, Celeste said with fierce determination. We face them together, and we end this before they can hurt anyone else. But even as she spoke, she could feel the barriers around New Orleans beginning to fluctuate. The ancient ones had found a weakness, not in the magical protections themselves, but in the emotional turmoil their very presence was creating among the city's defenders. Fear was a contagion, and it was spreading through the supernatural. Community like wildfire, a window exploded inward without warning, sending shards of glass cascading across Marie's bedroom floor. Through the shattered opening poured something that was less creature than living shadow. A writhing mass of darkness shot through with veins of sickly green light that hurt to look at directly. Dante moved faster than thought, placing himself between Celeste and the intruder while simultaneously drawing a blade that gleamed with silver fire. But the shadow thing was already speaking, its voice like the whisper of wind through graveyards. The new guardian awakens at last, it hissed, its form shifting and flowing like smoke given substance. How lovely she is, how bright her power. Burns, Morgan will be so pleased to finally meet Marie's successor. Get out of here, Dante snarled, his blade cutting through the shadow creature's form. It reformed instantly, laughing with a sound like breaking glass. Such devotion, such fierce protection. Does she know what you've done, vampire? Does she know what you sacrificed the last time you loved someone? Celeste felt Dante's pain like a physical blow, transmitted through the bond they'd formed. There was a story there, a wound that had never properly healed, and the shadow creature was deliberately prodding at it. That's enough, Celeste said, stepping forward with power blazing in her eyes. She raised her hand, and golden light erupted from her palm, striking the intruder with enough force to make it shriek and recoil. But instead of being destroyed, the creature seemed to drink in her attack, growing larger and more solid with each passing second. Yes, it purred. Show us your strength, little guardian. Show us the power we're going to steal from you. More shadows began pouring through the broken window, not individual creatures, but pieces of the same vast entity. A consciousness so alien and malevolent that Celeste's mind recoiled from trying to comprehend it. This was just a scout, she realized with growing horror. A single tendril of something immensely larger and more dangerous. We cannot stay here, Dante said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the bedroom door. The house's protections are being overwhelmed. They ran through corridors that were rapidly filling with creeping darkness, their footsteps echoing on hardwood floors that groaned and worked under the influence of supernatural cold. Behind them, Celeste could hear the shadow thing spreading through Marie's beautiful home, their presence corrupting everything they touched. But as they reached the main staircase, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of fleeing, she turned back toward the advancing darkness and raised both hands, drawing on every ounce of power the Nexus had given her. "This is my grandmother's house," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made the very walls respond. "You are not welcome here." Light exploded from her body, not the gentle golden glow she'd been learning to control, but something fierce and primal, the raw essence of a guardian's protective instincts. The shadows shrieked and recoiled, their forms dissolving under the onslaught of pure magical force, but the effort left Celeste drained, swaying on her feet as the magnitude of power she'd channeled took its toll. Dante caught her before she could fall, his strong arms supporting her as she struggled to remain conscious. Incredible, he murmured, looking back at the corridor she cleared of invaders. I've never seen raw protective magic that powerful. It's not enough, Celeste gasped, leaning into his strength as her body shook with exhaustion. They're just testing us. That wasn't even a real attack. As if summoned by her words, Morgan's voice suddenly filled the night air, amplified by supernatural power until it could be heard across every neighborhood in New Orleans. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of ancient malice and absolute certainty. People of the hidden world, his voice rolled like thunder through the darkness, your time of safety is ending. For too long you have cowered behind barriers, built by weak mortals and maintained by foolish vampires. But the old order dies tonight. Celeste felt Dante tense beside her as Morgan's message continued, each word carefully chosen to spread maximum fear and doubt. I offer you a choice, creatures, of shadow and moonlight. Join with us willingly, and you will have a place in the new world we create, a world where the strong rule as they were meant to, where supernatural beings need no longer hide from inferior mortals. Refuse, and you will burn with the city you sought to protect. He's trying to turn the community against itself, Dante said grimly. If enough supernatural beings become convinced that resistance is hopeless ... the barriers will fall from within, Celeste finished, understanding the strategy immediately. We need to reach the others. We need to show them that we can fight back. But even as they prepared to leave Murray's house for the relative safety of the council chambers, Celeste could feel the Ancient One's influence spreading through New Orleans like a cancer. Fear was weakening the magical protection she'd just renewed, and doubt was undermining the unity that had protected the city. For centuries, the battle for New Orleans had begun, and the enemy was already winning. The journey through the French Quarter to reach St. Louis Cathedral was like traveling through a city under siege. Supernatural beings who normally remained hidden from mortal eyes were now visible everywhere, vampires moving and coordinated. Patrols along the rooftops, shapeshifters prowling the shadowed alleyways, and other creatures Celeste couldn't identify taking defensive positions around key magical locations, but it was the fear she could feel radiating from every hidden corner that truly drove home the magnitude of what they were facing. Morgan's broadcast had achieved exactly what he'd intended. The supernatural community was fracturing under the weight of terror and uncertainty. Dante guided her through back streets and hidden passages she never would have known existed, his supernatural senses alert for any sign of ancient ones who might have breached the outer barriers. Twice they had to take shelter in doorways while writhing shadows passed overhead, creatures of living darkness that seemed to be mapping the city's defenses in preparation for a larger assault. How did they get so close without Murray's wards? Detecting them earlier? Celeste asked as they pressed themselves against the wall of an antique shop, waiting for another patrol of shadow creatures to pass. Because they're not fully here yet, Dante replied, his voice barely above a whisper. What we're seeing are projections, scouts operating from just beyond our dimensional boundaries. They're testing our responses, learning our capabilities, all while remaining safely outside the range of direct retaliation. The implication was chilling. If these mere projections could cause such widespread panic, what would happen when the Ancient Ones committed their full strength to the assault? They reached the cathedral without further incident, but the moment they descended into the council chambers, Celeste could see that the situation was far worse than she'd feared. The vast circular room that had seemed so impressive and secure just hours earlier now felt like a bunker under siege. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows on the stone walls, and the air thrummed with the desperate energy of beings preparing for a battle. They weren't certain they could win. Gabriel stood at the obsidian table's head, his usually composed demeanor cracked with strain as he coordinated reports from scouts throughout the city. Maps of New Orleans were spread across the table's surface, marked with glowing symbols that tracked the movement of both defending forces and enemy incursions. Vivian paced along the chamber's perimeter, her ethereal beauty marred by an expression of cold fury. Her ice-blue eyes blazed with the righteous anger of someone whose sanctuary had been violated, and Celeste could see threads of silver light flowing around her hands as she prepared defensive spells of considerable power. But it was Sebastian who drew Celeste's immediate attention. The vampire stood before a wall covered in ancient symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight, his pale hands moving in intricate patterns as he wove what looked like reconnaissance magic. His colorless eyes were closed in concentration, but she could see tension in every line of his body. "Report," Gabriel said without looking up as Dante and Celeste entered the chamber. "Marie's house was infiltrated by shadow scouts," Dante replied. Tersely, they seemed more interested in studying Celeste's capabilities than in causing actual damage. But they corrupted the building's protective wards in the process. As expected, Gabriel nodded grimly. "They're gathering intelligence on our new guardian while simultaneously demonstrating their ability to breach what should have been impregnable defenses." He finally looked up from his maps, and Celeste could see centuries of command experience in his dark eyes. "The question now is whether we can unite the community quickly enough to mount an effective resistance." "What's the current status?" Celeste asked, moving to study the maps spread across the table. The magical tracking symbols painted a disturbing picture. Red markers indicating Ancient One activity were scattered throughout the French Quarter and beyond, while the green symbols representing allied defenders seemed clustered in isolated pockets with large gaps between them. "Approximately 60% of the supernatural community is still committed to resistance," Vivian reported, her French accent sharp with frustration. "But the remainder are either fleeing the city or seriously considering Morgan's offer of alliance. Fear is a more effective weapon than we anticipated." Sebastian opened his eyes and turned from his mystical workings, his expression grim. "My reconnaissance spells have penetrated their outer formations. The entity we know as Morgan is not simply a powerful ancient one. He appears to be some form of collective consciousness, a hive mind controlling dozens of individual shadow forms." The implications of that revelation hit Celeste like a physical blow. They weren't facing a single enemy, no matter how powerful, but an entire species of predators working in perfect coordination. "How do we fight something like that?" she asked, trying to keep the despair out of her voice. "The same way our predecessors fought impossible odds for centuries," Gabriel replied with forced confidence. "Through unity, strategy, and the application of superior magical techniques." He gestured to the maps before them. "The ancient ones are powerful, but they're not invincible. They have weaknesses we can exploit, such as..." Dante asked, moving to stand behind Celeste's chair in a gesture that was both protective and supportive. "They exist primarily in spaces between dimensions," Sebastian explained, returning to the group around the table. "To affect our reality directly, they need anchor points, locations where the barriers between worlds are naturally thin. There are 7 such points in New Orleans, and they'll need to control at least 4 of them to establish a stable foothold in our dimension." Vivian moved to the table and began placing silver markers at specific locations on the maps. "The cemetery where you first encountered Morgan is one anchor point. The Nexus chamber beneath this cathedral is another. The remaining 5 are scattered throughout the city: the old plantation house in the Garden District, the convergence point beneath the French Market, the ritual circle in City Park, the lighthouse on the lakefront, and she hesitated before placing the final marker: Marie's house on Royal Street. Celeste felt her heart sink as she realized the full scope of what they were facing. The Ancient Ones didn't just want to conquer New Orleans, they wanted to remake it into a bridgehead for invasion of the entire mortal world. "So we defend the anchor points," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "We fortify each location and hold them against attack." "It's not that simple," Gabriel replied. "We don't have enough defenders to adequately protect 7 locations simultaneously. And even if we did, the Ancient Ones only need to capture 4 anchor points to achieve their goals. They can afford to lose 3 battles as long as they win 4. The mathematical reality of their situation was stark and unforgiving. No matter how they distributed their forces, they would be outnumbered at every critical location. "Then we don't fight defensively," Dante said suddenly, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had just realized something important. "We go on the offensive. Instead of trying to hold 7 positions with inadequate forces, we identify and strike." At their command structure, Sebastian looked intrigued despite his earlier pessimism. "You're suggesting we target Morgan directly?" "I'm suggesting we target whatever is controlling Morgan," Dante replied. Sebastian's reconnaissance revealed that he's operating as part of a collective consciousness. That means there's a central node, a primary anchor that's coordinating the entire invasion force. Celeste felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest as she began to understand his strategy. If we can sever that connection, the individual shadow forms become uncoordinated, confused, vulnerable, Gabriel finished, his expression brightening with the first genuine optimism she'd seen from him all night. "It's risky. We'd be committing our strongest defenders to a single assault instead of protecting the city directly. But if it works, it would end the threat entirely," Vivian said, her ice blue eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. "I like it. It's bold, decisive, and completely unexpected." But Sebastian looked troubled as he considered the implications. "There's a problem with that strategy. To reach the primary anchor point, someone would have to venture into the spaces between dimensions where the Ancient Ones exist in their true forms. The magical stresses involved would be lethal to any vampire, and even a guardian of Celeste's power might not survive the experience." The chamber fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. They had identified a potential path to victory, but it might require a sacrifice that none of them were prepared to make. "There might be another way," Celeste said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "The bonding with the Nexus gave me access to knowledge from every guardian who came before me. I can feel their memories, their experiences, their accumulated wisdom. If I can reach deeper into that connection—" "Absolutely not," Dante interrupted, his voice sharp with alarm. "Drawing too heavily on ancestral memories can fragment your consciousness, leaving you lost in the past while your body exists in the present. It's one of the most dangerous forms of magical practice. But if it works," Celeste countered, "I might gain access to techniques that were lost centuries ago. Spells powerful enough to strike at the Ancient Ones in their home dimension, without physically traveling there." Gabriel studied her with calculating eyes. "The risk would be enormous. If you become lost in ancestral memories, we lose both our guardian and our only hope of victory. And if we don't try," Celeste replied, "we lose everything anyway." She looked around the table at the 3 vampires who had served her family for generations, then up at Dante, whose love had already become the anchor point of her existence. "I have to try. It's what Marie would do. It's what any guardian would do." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears and desperate hopes. Finally, Gabriel nodded slowly. If you're determined to attempt this, we'll need to prepare carefully. The ritual space will have to be perfectly protected, and you'll need anchors in the present, bonds strong enough to guide you back from whatever depths you discover in the ancestral memories. I'll anchor her, Dante said immediately, his voice carrying absolute certainty. The connection between us is strong enough to serve as a lifeline. As will I, Gabriel added. The bonds of service between my bloodline and the Guardians run deep enough to provide additional stability. Vivian and Sebastian nodded their agreement, and Celeste felt a warmth that had nothing to do with magic spreading through her chest. She might be preparing to risk everything, but she wasn't facing that risk alone. Then we begin preparations immediately, she said, standing with newfound determination. Morgan and his forces expect us to cower behind our defenses until they're ready to strike. Instead, we'll hit them when they least expect it. As the council began planning the most dangerous magical working any of them had ever attempted, Celeste caught Dante's eye across the table. The love she saw there, combined with his unwavering faith in her abilities, gave her the courage she needed to face what was coming. The Ancient Ones had made one critical error. They had assumed that love would make her weaker. They were about to learn how very wrong they were. The ritual chamber they prepared lay even deeper beneath the cathedral than the Nexus itself, in spaces that predated human settlement of New Orleans by centuries. Ancient stone walls were carved with symbols that seemed to move and breathe in. The flickering candlelight and the air thrummed with power so concentrated it felt almost solid. Gabriel, Vivian, and Sebastian worked with practiced efficiency to create the protective circles and anchor points that would keep Celeste tethered to the present while her consciousness dove into the dangerous depths of ancestral memory. Silver lines traced intricate patterns across the stone floor, connecting crystals that pulsed with stored magical energy to create a web of safety around the central ritual space. But it was Dante who drew Celeste's attention as she prepared for the most dangerous working of her life. He moved around the chamber with fluid grace, placing focusing stones at precise intervals while murmuring incantations in languages that predated recorded history. Every gesture spoke of centuries of experience with magic far darker and more complex than anything she'd yet encountered. "You've done this before," she said, not really asking a question. He paused in his preparations, his dark eyes meeting hers across the ritual space. "Not exactly this, but I've served as an anchor for dangerous workings before. I know what it feels like when someone you..." He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "When someone important ventures into spaces where they might not return." The pain in his voice was so raw that Celeste felt it like a physical blow. This was the wound the shadow creature had referenced, the loss that still haunted him after all these years. "Tell me," she said softly. For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and she saw the careful control. He maintained slip just enough to reveal the grief beneath. "Her name was Isabella," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was a guardian too, one of Marie's predecessors. I loved her as completely as I've ever loved anyone. When the Ancient Ones threatened New Orleans in 1847, she attempted a similar ritual to the one you're planning now." Celeste felt her heart constrict with sudden understanding. What happened? She dove too deep into ancestral memory and couldn't find her way back. "I held the anchor for 3 days and nights, calling to her, pouring my own life force into the connection between us. But in the end, double quotes, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. In the end, I had to choose between losing her forever and losing her body as well. I severed the connection and watched her consciousness scatter into fragments among the memories of the dead. The chamber had gone completely silent. Even Gabriel, Vivian, and Sebastian had stopped their preparations. to listen to a story none of them had heard in its entirety. Dante, Celeste breathed, moving toward him despite the unfinished ritual circles. No, he said, raising a hand to stop her. You need to hear all of it. Isabella's sacrifice did give us the knowledge we needed to defeat that particular incursion. The techniques she recovered from ancestral memory allowed Marie to banish the Ancient Ones for over a century. But the cost... He met her eyes with an intensity that was almost painful. The cost was everything. This is different, Celeste said with quiet conviction. I'm different. And you're different too. Stronger, more experienced, more determined. You won't let me get lost. How can you be so certain? She stepped closer, reaching up to frame his face with her hands, just as he had done for her so many times. Because you love me, and I love you. Isabella may have had your devotion, but she didn't have your heart the way I do. I can feel it, Dante. The connection between us is stronger than anything you've ever experienced before. Something shifted in his expression, hope warring with terror, love battling against the memory of devastating loss. If I lose you, you won't, she said with absolute certainty. I trust you to bring me home. The ritual preparations took another hour to complete, but finally everything was ready. Celeste lay in the center of the protective circles, her body cushioned by silk pillows that had been blessed with preservation spells. The focusing crystals hummed with stored energy around her, and the silver lines traced across the floor glowed. With soft, steady light, Gabriel, Vivian, and Sebastian took their positions at the cardinal points around the ritual space, their hands already beginning to weave the protective spells that would shield her consciousness during its journey. But it was Dante who knelt beside her, his fingers intertwined with hers, his dark eyes fixed on her face with unwavering attention. Remember, Gabriel said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of magical practice. You're looking for techniques that can strike across dimensional boundaries. The Ancient One's true forms exist in spaces between realities. Find the spells that can reach them there. And remember the danger, Sebastian added grimly. Ancestral memories are seductive. The deeper you go, the more tempting it becomes to remain in the past, to live in moments when power was simpler and threats were clearer. Don't let yourself become lost in nostalgia for times you never actually experienced. Vivian's contribution was characteristically direct. Stay focused on returning to us. The past is full of wonders, but the present is where you belong. Celeste nodded her understanding, then looked up into Dante's eyes one final time. I love you, she whispered. I love you too, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Come back to me. She closed her eyes and began the incantation that would send her consciousness diving backward through 2 centuries of inherited memory. The transition was like falling through layers of gossamer, each ancestral memory she passed. Through tried to catch her, to draw her into its particular time and place. She saw Marie as a young woman, barely older than Celeste herself, standing against creatures of shadow with power blazing from her hands. She experienced her great-grandmother Elena's first bonding with the Nexus, felt the overwhelming rush of knowledge and responsibility that came with accepting the guardian mantle. But she pushed deeper, following threads of inherited knowledge back, through generations of strong women who had protected New Orleans with their lives and souls. Each memory offered its own temptations, moments of triumph, periods of peace, times when the burden of guardianship had seemed lighter than it did in the present. Stay focused, she reminded herself, even as part of her consciousness lingered, over a particularly beautiful memory of her ancestor Evangeline dancing with Gabriel in this very chamber during a celebration that had lasted 3 days. Deeper still, past memories of individual women and into the collective knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of magical practice. Here, the temptation was even stronger. She could feel the wisdom of ages calling to her, offering understanding of mysteries that no single guardian had ever fully grasped, but she could also feel Dante's presence like a warm flame at the edge of her consciousness, the anchor that would guide her back to the present when her work was done. His love was a constant thread connecting her to the world she needed to return to, and she used it to maintain her sense of self as she dove into knowledge so ancient it predated language itself. There, deep in the collective memory of her bloodline, she found what she was looking for: techniques developed by the very first guardian, methods of magical combat that had been deemed too dangerous for regular use and gradually forgotten as more conventional approaches proved adequate for most threats. The spells she discovered were breathtaking in their elegance and terrifying in their power. They worked by creating resonance cascades across dimensional boundaries, using the Ancient One's own collective consciousness against them. If properly executed, the technique could shatter the connections that allowed them to operate as a unified force, leaving individual shadow forms confused and vulnerable. But the cost of such magic was enormous. The guardian casting it would need to open herself completely to the flow of power through the ley lines beneath New Orleans, becoming a conduit for energies that could easily destroy an unprepared mind. Previous attempts had resulted in guardians being consumed by the very forces they sought to control, unless, Celeste realized as she studied the ancient knowledge more carefully, unless they had anchors strong enough to ground them during the casting. Isabella had attempted this magic alone, trusting only in her own strength and willpower. But Celeste wouldn't be alone. She had Dante's love as an anchor, the Council's loyalty as support, and bonds of affection that had proven strong enough to survive even death itself. She began the delicate process of copying the ancient techniques into her own memory, weaving the knowledge into her consciousness in ways that would allow her to access it in the present. But as she worked, she became aware that something else was stirring in the depths of ancestral memory. The Ancient Ones had noticed her presence. So came a voice like the whisper of dead leaves. The new guardian seeks forbidden knowledge in the memories of the dead. How deliciously predictable. Shadows began to gather at the edges of her consciousness. Not the protective darkness of ancestral memory, but something alien and hungry that had no business existing in this space. You think your pathetic love will protect you here? The voice grew stronger, more substantial. You think the devotion of a single vampire can stand against power older than your species? The shadows pressed closer, and Celeste felt them trying to sever her connection to the present, to trap her in the depths of memory where they could feed on her power at their leisure. But just as panic began to set in, she felt Dante's presence blazing across the connection between them. Not just love, but fury, a vampire's protective rage, focused with lethal precision on anything that dared threaten what belonged to him. Mine. His consciousness roared across the dimensional space, and the force of his claims sent the Ancient One's shadows recoiling. She is mine, and I am hers, and nothing in any dimension will change that. The bond between them flared with power that made the attacking shadows shriek and dissolve, and Celeste felt herself being drawn back toward the present with irresistible force. She clutched the stolen knowledge to her consciousness like precious treasure and let Dante's love carry her home. She opened her eyes in the ritual chamber to find him leaning over her, his face tight with concern and residual anger from the battle he'd fought to protect her consciousness. "Did you find it?" Gabriel asked immediately. "I found it," Celeste confirmed, sitting up carefully as the knowledge she'd retrieved settled into her awareness. "I found the weapon we need to end this war." But even as she spoke, she could feel the Ancient One's rage pressing against the barriers around New Orleans. They knew she had stolen their secrets, and they were done with subtle approaches. The final battle was about to begin. The assault began at exactly midnight, when the veil between dimensions was thinnest and the Ancient One's power reached its peak. Celeste felt it the moment the barriers around New Orleans began to buckle, a sensation like the world itself was screaming in pain as forces older than civilization pressed against the magical protections that had guarded the city for centuries. The cathedral shook around them, ancient stones groaning under supernatural pressure that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the fundamental laws of reality being stretched to their breaking point. They're hitting all 7 anchor points simultaneously, Sebastian reported, his pale eyes blazing with silver fire as his reconnaissance spells brought back images of chaos erupting across the city. The cemetery, the French market, City Park, the Garden District mansion, the lakefront lighthouse, Marie's house, and ... double quotes, he paused, his expression growing grim. They found a way to attack the Nexus chamber directly. Through the stone walls around them, Celeste could hear the sound of battle and human shrieks, mixing with the clash of supernatural forces as the vampire community fought desperately to hold their positions. But she could also feel the barriers weakening with each passing moment, and she knew they had minutes at most before the Ancient Ones broke through in sufficient numbers to overwhelm any defense. "How long do you need?" Gabriel asked, his aristocratic features tight with strain as he coordinated the city's magical defenses from the obsidian table. Celeste closed her eyes and reached for the ancient knowledge she'd retrieved from ancestral memory. The spell she'd discovered was incredibly complex, requiring precise manipulation of forces that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Under normal circumstances, it would take hours of careful preparation to cast safely. 20 minutes, she said, opening her eyes to meet Gabriel's concerned gaze. Maybe 15 if I push beyond safe limits. We don't have 15 minutes, Vivian said bluntly, her ice blue eyes reflecting the magical fires that were beginning to flicker along the chamber walls as the cathedral's deepest protections activated. The anchor points are falling faster than we anticipated. As if to underscore her words, a tremor ran through the building that was felt as much in the soul as in the body. One of the 7 anchor points had been compromised. Celeste could feel the dimensional breach opening like a wound in reality itself. "Then we make our own time," Dante said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that meant he was preparing for battle. "I'll go to the surface and coordinate a counterattack. Buy you the minutes you need." "No," Celeste said immediately, catching his hand as he turned toward the chamber's exit. "I need you here. The spell requires an anchor strong enough to keep me grounded while I channel power from every ley line in New Orleans. Without you, without me, you'll attempt it anyway," he finished, his dark eyes seeing straight through her attempt at manipulation. "And you'll likely die in the process." Another tremor shook the cathedral, stronger this time. Through the stone walls, they could hear the sounds of combat growing closer as the Ancient One's forces pressed deeper into the city's heart. "There has to be another way," Gabriel said, but even as he spoke, Celeste could see the doubt in his expression. They were running out of options as quickly as they were running out of time. That's when Celeste made a decision that surprised even herself. "Then we do both," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that made everyone in the chamber turn to look at her. "Dante goes to the surface to lead the counterattack, but he maintains the anchor connection from there. The bond between us is strong enough to work across distance, and this way we can coordinate the magical and military aspects of our defense." "Celeste," Dante said, his voice heavy with concern, the strain of maintaining an anchor connection while engaged in active combat "will be enormous," she finished for him. "But you're strong enough to handle it. We're strong enough together." She stepped closer, framing his face with her hands just as she had during the ancestral memory ritual. "Trust me. Trust us." For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Then his expression shifted, and she saw the moment he committed himself completely to the plan, regardless of the personal cost. Always, he said simply, and the single word carried the weight of an eternal vow. He kissed her then, fierce and desperate and full of everything they might not have the chance to say if the gambit failed. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Celeste could feel the anchor connection solidifying between them, not just emotional now, but magical, a bond that would allow them to share power and sensation across any distance. Go, she whispered. Against his lips, I'll be right behind you. Dante turned to Gabriel and Sebastian, his demeanor shifting instantly to that of a military commander. I'll need every available fighter converging on Jackson Square. If we can draw the main force away from the anchor points, it might give Celeste the opening she needs. Consider it done, Gabriel replied, already moving toward the chamber's exit. Vivian, coordinate with the shapeshifter clans. Sebastian, rally the independent supernaturals. Everything we have committed now. As the three vampires prepared to leave for what might be their final battle, Celeste felt a moment of overwhelming gratitude for these beings who had served her family for generations. They were about to risk everything on the word of a 17-year-old girl who had known about magic for less than a week. Thank you, she said, the simple words carrying all the emotion she couldn't express. Gabriel's smile was warm and surprisingly paternal. It has been an honor serving your bloodline, Celeste Martin. May the ancestors guide your magic. Vivian's ice blue eyes softened for just a moment. Make us proud, little guardian. Sebastian's nod was curt but respectful. And this, then they, were gone, and Celeste was alone in the chamber with the most dangerous spell in Guardian history in 20 minutes. To save her city dot, she moved to the center of the ritual space and began the complex preparations the ancient knowledge required. Silver lines had to be redrawn in specific patterns, crystals repositioned to channel different types of energy, and protective circles modified to handle power flows that could easily kill an unprepared caster. But even as she worked, she could feel Dante's presence through their bond, distant but constant, a warm flame at the edge of her consciousness that told her he was alive and fighting. Through their connection, she caught glimpses of the battle raging above, vampires moving with deadly grace through the French Quarter, their supernatural speed and strength turning them into living weapons against the shadow creatures pouring through dimensional breaches. The Ancient One's assault was more coordinated than anyone had anticipated. Instead of mindless destruction, they were executing a carefully planned campaign designed to overwhelm specific defensive positions while leaving others isolated and vulnerable. It was the strategy of beings who had been planning this conquest. For decades, another anchor point fell, and Celeste felt the dimensional barriers around New Orleans buckle further. The temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably as alien cold began seeping through cracks in reality itself. Focus, she told herself, even as part of her attention remained locked on Dante's battle above. The spell has to be perfect, or it won't work at all. The ancient technique she'd recovered was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. By creating a resonance cascade across the ley lines beneath New Orleans, she could generate a magical pulse that would propagate across dimensional boundaries and strike directly at the collective consciousness coordinating the Ancient Ones. Assault. If successful, it would shatter their unity and leave individual shadow forms confused and vulnerable to conventional attacks. But the casting required her to open herself completely to the flow of power through every ley line in the city simultaneously. The magical energies involved were enough to level buildings and reshape landscapes, and all of it would be flowing through her body and soul for the duration of the spell. I won't survive this, she realized with sudden crystal clarity. Even with Dante anchoring me, even with perfect technique, The human body isn't designed to channel this much power. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her. She was 17 years old, had been in love for less than a day, and was about to sacrifice her life for a city she'd known for less than a week. Then she felt Dante's love blazing across their bond, not just affection, but the soul deep devotion that had made him willing to fight impossible odds for her sake. And she remembered Marie's words from the journal. Love is not a weakness to be conquered, but a strength to be embraced. She wouldn't survive the casting. But maybe survival wasn't the point. Maybe the point was making sure the people she loved had a chance to build something beautiful in the world she was about to save. I love you, she sent across the bond to Dante, pouring all of her emotions into the mental touch. His response was immediate and fierce. I love you too, and I'm not letting you die. Before she could ask what he meant, she felt his presence in the bond suddenly intensify. Not just emotional connection anymore, but something deeper. He was offering to share the magical load of the spell, to split the power flow between them so that neither would be destroyed by forces too great for any single person to contain. You'll con us. Die too, she protested. Then we die together, he replied with absolute certainty. That I'd rather face eternity with you than spend it without you. Above them, the battle for New Orleans raged with increasing desperation as more anchor points fell to the Ancient One's assault. But in the chamber beneath the cathedral, a guardian and her vampire prepared to gamble everything on love being stronger than death. Celeste began the final phase of the casting, feeling power from 7 major ley lines beginning to flow through her body like liquid starlight. Through the bond, she felt Dante accepting half the magical load, his vampire physiology, proving more resilient to the supernatural energies than her merely human frame. The Ancient One's collective consciousness noticed what they were attempting and turned its full attention towards stopping them. Shadow creatures began materializing directly in the chamber, bypassing all protective barriers as they sought to disrupt the casting before it could reach completion, but they were too late. The resonance cascade was already building, and Celeste could feel it propagating across dimensional boundaries with unstoppable momentum. For New Orleans, she thought as the spell reached its crescendo. For love, Dante added through their bond. Together, they unleashed enough power to reshape the supernatural world forever. The moment the resonance cascade reached full power, reality itself seemed to pause. Celeste felt the spell propagate across dimensional boundaries with the force of a collapsing star, carrying her consciousness along with it as magical energy flowed through her body in torrents that should have reduced her to ash in seconds. But Dante's presence in their bond was like an anchor of pure will, his vampire strength absorbing half the devastating power flow and leaving her just barely able to maintain coherent thought. Through their shared awareness, she experienced the spell's effects as they rippled across the spaces between dimensions where the Ancient Ones existed in their true forms. The resonance cascade struck their collective consciousness like a perfectly tuned note shattering crystal, disrupting the unified intelligence that had coordinated their assault on New Orleans for so long. The sound that echoed across both dimensions was unlike anything she'd ever heard. Not quite scream, not quite song, but something that spoke of fundamental forces being torn apart at their most basic level. The Ancient One's hive mind fractured into thousands of confused, separate entities, each suddenly cut off from the vast intelligence that had given their existence meaning. Above them, the battle for New Orleans shifted in an instant. Shadow creatures that had been moving with deadly coordination suddenly became disoriented and vulnerable, striking out blindly at anything nearby rather than executing the carefully planned tactics they'd been using moments before. Through Dante's connection, Celeste felt Gabriel, Vivian, and Sebastian pressing their advantage. leading the supernatural defenders in a counterattack that began systematically eliminating the confused invaders that the magical forces flowing through her body were too vast, too alien for any mortal form to contain for long. She could feel herself beginning to disintegrate at the cellular level as power meant to reshape continents poured through flesh and bone that had never been designed for such stresses. Celeste, Dante's voice echoed through their bond, tight with pain and desperate determination. Hold on, just a little longer. She could feel him fighting the same battle, his vampire physiology, more resilient than her human frame, but still struggling to contain energies that existed on a scale beyond individual comprehension. The magical load he'd accepted to save her life was killing him just as surely as it was killing her. But he held on with the stubborn devotion that had made him willing to anchor her consciousness during the ancestral memory ritual. I'm sorry. She managed to send back through their connection. I'm sorry I'm taking you with me. Don't apologize for giving me the chance to die for something that matters. He replied, and she could feel the fierce joy underlying his pain. I've lived for centuries, Celeste, but I've only truly been alive since I met you. The spell was nearing completion now, its effects propagating through dimensions she couldn't even name as it systematically dismantled the Ancient One's ability to operate as a unified force. But success was coming at a price that made her heart break, even as victory became certain. There has to be another way, she thought desperately. There has to be something, that single quotes when she felt it, a presence in the magical flow that wasn't. Dante wasn't her, wasn't even fully alive in any conventional sense. The ancestors, the generations of guardian women whose memories she'd touched during her dive into the past, were somehow manifesting in the spell itself. We're here, came. Marie's voice, warm and loving and infinitely sad. We have always been here, waiting for this moment, the moment when love proves stronger than death, added another voice, Evangeline, the first guardian to forge the alliance with the vampire clans, the moment when a guardian chooses to save, rather than rule, contributed a third presence, one of the women from the deep past whose name had been lost to history, but whose love for the city remained UND. Suddenly, the chamber filled with ghostly light as the spirits of every guardian who had ever lived began to manifest around Celeste and Dante. They appeared not as they had died, but as they had lived, young, strong, radiant with the power they had, wielded in defense of the city they loved. You are not alone, Marie said, her spectral form moving to place translucent hands on Celeste's shoulders. You have never been alone. The love that flows through our bloodline is not diminished by death. It grows stronger. The other ancestors took positions around the ritual space, their combined presence creating a buffer between the living lovers and the destructive forces of the spell. Celeste felt the pressure on her body diminish as generations of guardian magic absorbed part of the power flow, spreading the load across souls that no longer had physical forms to be destroyed, but the spell still requires completion. Warned, Evangeline, her eyes fixed on the dimensional breach that was still pouring ancient ones into their reality. And that completion requires sacrifice from the living, not death, Marie said firmly. Transformation, Celeste felt understanding dawn like sunrise in her consciousness. The ancestors weren't offering to complete the spell for her. They were offering to help her transcend the limitations of mortal flesh, to become something that could channel such vast powers without being destroyed by them. A guardian eternal, breathed one of the ancient spirits. Neither fully alive nor truly dead, but something new. Something unprecedented. What about Dante? Celeste asked. Even as she felt the magical transformation beginning in her cells, the bond between you has grown beyond anything we have ever seen, Marie replied, her spectral eyes shining with pride and wonder. It has become something that exists. independent of physical form. Where you go, he will follow. What you become, he will share. Through their connection, Celeste felt Dante's understanding mirror her own. The choice being offered wasn't between life and death. It was between mortality and something that had never existed before. A form of existence that would allow them to protect New Orleans for centuries to come, together. She asked not always. He replied without hesitation. The transformation began at the point where their hands were joined, spreading outward like liquid starlight as their physical forms dissolved and reformed into something that could exist comfortably in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Celeste felt her consciousness expand beyond the limitations of a single body, her awareness suddenly encompassing the entire magical structure of New Orleans, while somehow remaining centered in her love for the vampire beside her, Dante's presence. In the bond intensified until she could no longer tell where her thoughts ended and his began. But instead of losing herself in the merger, she felt more completely herself than she ever had, as if she'd finally discovered the missing piece that made her whole. The resonance cascade reached its final crescendo, and reality reshuffled itself around them. The Ancient One's collective consciousness shattered completely, its constituent entities fleeing back to whatever dark spaces had spawned them. The dimensional breaches sealed themselves with audible snaps of displaced air, and the supernatural cold that had been seeping into New Orleans retreated like fog before sunlight dot in Jackson Square. Gabriel looked up at the stars suddenly visible, through clouds that had been filled with supernatural darkness moments before. Around him, the surviving defenders cheered as the last of the shadow creatures dissolved into nothingness, their forms no longer able to maintain coherence without the collective intelligence to guide them. But it was Vivian who felt it first. The change in the city's magical atmosphere as new guardians took their place in the eternal watch over New Orleans. In the chamber beneath St. Louis Cathedral, where two lovers had been willing to die for each other in their city, something unprecedented was being born. Celeste and Dante emerged from the transformation hand in hand, their physical forms restored but fundamentally changed. They were still recognizably themselves, but they glowed with soft golden light that spoke of power held in perfect balance. "Did it," Celeste whispered, marveling at the way her voice seemed to resonate across multiple dimensions simultaneously. "We survived it." Dante agreed, his dark eyes now flecked with the same golden radiance that danced through her auburn hair. Around them, the ancestral spirits began to fade, their task completed and their descendants safe in forms that would allow them to protect New Orleans for as long as the city existed. "Guard it well," Marie said as her ghostly form started to dissolve. "Love it fiercely. And remember that the greatest magic of all is the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who cannot protect themselves." As the last of the ancestors faded into peaceful rest, Celeste and Dante stood alone in the chamber where they had chosen love over safety, sacrifice over survival, and each other over everything else in existence. They were no longer fully human, no longer entirely vampire, but something new. Guardians eternal, bonded in love and magic for as long as the stars continued to shine over New Orleans. The city above them began to stir back to life, its supernatural defenders emerging from hiding to discover that the threat they'd feared for so long had been permanently ended. The Ancient Ones were gone, their power broken, their collective intelligence scattered beyond hope of recovery. But in the chamber beneath the cathedral, two transformed lovers were already planning for the challenges yet to come. Because while this battle had been won, the supernatural world was vast and full of dangers that would always require guardians willing to stand between the darkness and the light. What happens now? Celeste asked, intertwining her fingers with Dante's and marveling at the way their combined radiance seemed to make the ancient stones around them sing with contentment. Now, Dante replied, his voice warm with love and bright with hope for their impossible future. We learn what forever actually means. 3 days after the battle that saved New Orleans, Celeste stood on the wrought iron balcony of Marie's Victorian house and watched the sun set over a city that was somehow more beautiful than it had ever been before. The transformation that had saved their lives had also changed the very fabric of New Orleans' magical atmosphere. Where once the supernatural community had hidden in shadows and whispered corners, now there was an openness, a sense of safety that allowed magic to flow more freely through the ancient streets. The gas lamps glowed with warmer light, the Spanish moss swayed with breezes that carried actual music instead of just sound, and the very air seemed to shimmer with possibilities that had never existed before. But the most remarkable change was in herself. Celeste raised her hand and watched golden light dance between her fingers, not the raw, barely controlled power she'd wielded during her awakening, but something refined and elegant, perfectly balanced between creation and destruction. She could feel the ley lines beneath the city humming in harmony with her heartbeat, could sense every supernatural being within 100-mile radius, could even perceive the subtle shifts in dimensional barriers that would alert her to any future threats long before they could become dangerous. "Beautiful," Dante said from behind her, his voice carrying the same warm affection that had become her constant companion since their transformation. She turned to find him leaning in the doorway, devastatingly handsome in the casual clothing he'd taken to wearing around the house. But it was his eyes that drew her attention, the same dark brown she'd fallen in love with, but now flecked with the same golden radiance that danced through her own vision. The transformation had changed them both, making them something unprecedented. "In the supernatural world, what's beautiful?" she asked, moving toward him with the fluid grace that was another gift of their new existence. "You," he replied simply, reaching out to frame her face with hands that now glowed with the same inner light as her own. "The way you look when you're watching over the city, the expression you get when you're using your expanded senses to check on every supernatural being in New Orleans, making sure they're all safe and settled." It was true. One of the side effects of her transformation was an inability to stop caring about the welfare of everyone under her protection. She could feel them all like warm spots in her consciousness. Gabriel coordinating the reconstruction of damaged magical sites, Vivian establishing new treaties with supernatural communities from other cities, Sebastian training younger vampires in defensive techniques that would prevent future invasions. "Is it always going to be like this?" she asked, leaning into Dante's touch. "This need to constantly monitor everyone to make sure they're protected?" "Probably," he admitted with a soft smile. "But you're not carrying that responsibility alone anymore. I feel it too, the compulsion to protect, to watch over, to serve as guardian to those who need protection." His expression grew more serious. "We're bonded now in ways that go beyond anything recorded in Guardian history. Your responsibilities are mine, just as my devotion to you is absolute and eternal." The bond between them had indeed evolved into something unprecedented. Where once she'd been able to sense his emotions and general location, now their consciousness existed in a state of partial merger that allowed them to share thoughts, memories, and magical abilities as easily as breathing. It should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt like coming home after a lifetime of searching for something she'd never known she'd lost. "Gabriel wants to see us," Dante said, his hand sliding down to her waist in a gesture that was both tender and possessive. "The council is convening to discuss the new protocols we'll need now that the ancient ones have been eliminated." Celeste nodded, but didn't immediately move toward the door. There was something she needed to address first, a question that had been nagging at her since the transformation completed. The shadow creature that invaded the house, she said carefully. It mentioned something about your past, about someone you'd loved before. You started to tell me about Isabella, but ... Dante's expression grew somber, but not with the devastating pain she'd seen when the subject had first come up. The transformation seemed to have healed something in him as well, allowing him to remember his past love with sadness rather than soul-crushing grief. Isabella was a guardian from the 1840s, he said, guiding Celeste to sit with him on the elegant settee that had been Marie's favorite piece of furniture. I loved her completely, but it was a different kind of love than what I feel for you. Passionate, yes, but also desperate. I loved her because she was beautiful and powerful and needed protection. I loved her like a knight loves a princess in distress. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. But you ... I love you for who you are, not what you represent. I love your courage, your compassion, your willingness to sacrifice everything for people you barely know. I love the way you refused to let me face danger alone, the way you trusted our bond enough to share the most dangerous spell in Guardian history. His dark eyes met hers with an intensity that still made her pulse quicken. I love you as Anne, equal, as a partner, as the other half of my soul. And that kind of love ... that's strong enough to transcend death itself. The honesty in his words made her eyes fill with tears of joy rather than sorrow. This was what she'd sensed but hadn't been able to articulate. The difference between loving someone because of circumstances and loving them because of choice. I love you the same way, she whispered, leaning forward to kiss him with all the tenderness and passion that their new existence allowed. Not because you saved me, not because you're devastatingly handsome, but because you see me as someone worth fighting impossible odds for. Their kiss was different now than it had been when they were fully mortal. There was still the same desperate hunger, the same overwhelming need to be as close as possible, but underneath it was a certainty that hadn't existed before. They had literally given their lives for each other and emerged stronger on the other side. Whatever challenges their eternal existence might bring, they would face them together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unnecessarily hard since their transformed physiology no longer strictly required oxygen, Celeste felt a peace she'd never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for something to begin. She wasn't marking time until her real existence could start. This was her life, eternal, magical, devoted to protecting the city she'd come to love almost as much as the vampire beside her. We should go, Dante said reluctantly. Gabriel gets impatient when council meetings are delayed. The council chambers had been restored to their former elegance, but the atmosphere was celebratory rather than desperate. Gabriel sat at the obsidian table's head with something approaching contentment, while Vivian moved around the space with the fluid grace of someone no longer expecting attack from every shadow. Sebastian stood before maps that now showed New Orleans as a secure magical stronghold, rather than a city under siege. Ah, our eternal guardians arrive at last, Gabriel said, rising to greet them with genuine warmth. How does immortality suit you? It's an adjustment, Celeste admitted, still getting used to the way her enhanced senses picked up layers of information she'd never noticed before, but a welcome one. The supernatural community has been asking about you, Vivian said, settling into her chair with characteristic elegance. Word of your transformation has spread beyond New Orleans. There are requests for assistance from communities as far away as San Francisco and Miami, places that are dealing with their own supernatural threats. Celeste felt a flutter of concern. Are we talking about traveling? Leaving New Orleans? Not leaving, Sebastian clarified. but perhaps expanding your sphere of protection. Your new abilities aren't limited by geography the way traditional guardian magic was. You could theoretically protect multiple cities simultaneously. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Celeste had barely grown accustomed to her responsibilities as Guardian of New Orleans. The thought of expanding that protection to other cities seemed overwhelming, but then she felt Dante's presence in their bond, steady and supportive and absolutely certain. Through their connection, she could sense his thoughts. We're stronger than we know, and we're not facing this alone. One step at a time, she said finally. New Orleans comes first. Once we're certain the city is completely secure and the community has adjusted to the new magical equilibrium, then we can consider expanding our protection. Gabriel nodded approvingly. Wisdom beyond your years. Or perhaps wisdom that comes from having access to centuries of guardian experience through your ancestral connections. It was true. The transformation had left her with permanent access to the accumulated knowledge of every guardian who had come before her. She could feel their memories like a vast library in her mind, available whenever she needed guidance or historical perspective. But unlike the dangerous dive into ancestral memory she'd attempted during the ritual, this access was controlled and safe, integrated into her consciousness in ways that enhanced rather than overwhelmed her individual identity. There is one matter we need to discuss, Vivian said, her expression growing serious. The transformation you've undergone is unprecedented. We have no historical examples to guide us in understanding what you've become or what your new existence might require. You're still connected to the Nexus, but you're also something beyond what that crystal was designed to work with. Are you saying we might be incompatible with the city's existing magical structure? Dante asked, a note of concern entering his voice. Quite the opposite, Sebastian replied, consulting notes he'd made during his magical research over the past 3 days. Your presence has strengthened every protective spell, every ward, every magical barrier in the city. New Orleans is now better defended than it has been in recorded history. But, Gabriel added carefully, that level of protection comes with responsibilities. You're no longer just guardians of the city. You've become integral to its magical foundation. Your continued presence is necessary for the enhanced defenses to remain stable. The implication was clear. They were bound to New Orleans not just by choice and duty, but by the fundamental magical forces that kept the city safe. It should have felt like a prison, but instead Celeste found herself feeling grateful for the certainty it provided. I can think of worse fates than being magically bound to the most beautiful city in America, she said, moving to stand beside the window that looked out over the French Quarter. Especially when I get to share that fate with someone I love beyond. Reason. Dante joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. Together, they watched the lights of New Orleans twinkle in the gathering darkness, not just the electric illumination visible to mortal eyes, but the magical radiance that flowed through every building, every street, every hidden corner where supernatural beings had made their homes. So what happens now? She asked, leaning back against his chest and savoring the solid warmth of him. Now we learn, he replied, his voice soft with contentment. We explore what we've become, we protect what we love, and we discover what forever looks like when you're spending it with the right person. Through the chamber windows, they could see the French Quarter returning to its normal rhythm, tourists wandering the historic streets in search of ghost tours and jazz clubs, completely unaware that their safety was now ensured by two lovers who had chosen eternity over mortality and duty over personal desire. The supernatural community was rebuilding, stronger and more unified than it had been in centuries. The ancient ones were gone, scattered beyond hope of recovery. And in the heart of New Orleans, two eternal guardians had found not just purpose, that perfect love dot as the cathedral bells chimed midnight, marking the beginning of their first full day as transformed beings. Celeste felt a deep sense of rightness settle into her bones. This was what she'd been meant for, not the ordinary life she'd planned in Chicago, but this magical existence where every day brought new challenges and every night brought her deeper into love with the vampire who had become her eternal partner. "I love you," she whispered, turning in his arms to face him properly. "I love you too," he replied, his golden flecked eyes shining with devotion that would last as long as the stars. "Forever and always, ma chérie, forever and always." Their kiss was soft and sweet and full of promises for the centuries ahead, and around them, the magical heart of New Orleans pulsed with contentment, knowing that its guardians would never abandon their posts. The greatest love story in the French Quarter had only just begun.